The night Lady Eleanor Whitmore finally stopped waiting for the Duke of Blackmere began with a promise she believed was about to be fulfilled. For 6 years, Adrian Blackmere had asked her for patience. 6 years of whispered assurances, postponed plans, and quiet promises that one day, when his estate was secure, when his family no longer needed him, when his position at court was strong enough, he would finally make Eleanor his wife. She had believed every word. So when she entered the royal ballroom that winter evening, wearing the pale blue gown Adrian had once said he wanted to see her wear when their future was announced, Eleanor thought her waiting was finally over. Then the orchestra fell silent. Hundreds of nobles turned toward the center of the ballroom as Adrian stepped forward beneath the glittering chandeliers. Eleanor caught his gaze across the crowd, and for one breathless moment, her heart lifted. She had imagined this moment so many times that she almost knew how it would feel before it happened. But Adrian did not reach for her. He extended his hand toward Lady Celeste Harrington. The young woman stepped gracefully to his side, and the entire ballroom erupted in applause as Adrian announced that she would become the next Duchess of Blackmere. Eleanor heard almost none of it. Her eyes had fallen upon Celeste's hand. There, beneath the candlelight, rested the Blackmere engagement ring, the same family ring Adrian's mother had once taken Eleanor's hand and promised would belong to her someday. Still, Eleanor did not cry. She did not demand an explanation. She did what years of aristocratic training had taught her to do. She smiled while her heart broke, joined the applause, and watched the man she loved celebrate his future with another woman. Adrian found her moments later, after she quietly slipped from the ballroom, and what he told her in that empty palace gallery hurt more than the engagement itself. His marriage to Celeste, he explained, was political. His feelings for Eleanor had not changed. As far as he was concerned, nothing between them needed to change either. That was when Eleanor finally understood. Adrian had never truly believed he could lose her. He intended to give another woman his name, his title, and the place beside him before the world, while Eleanor remained somewhere in the shadows, loving him enough to accept whatever pieces he chose to leave behind. For 6 years, Eleanor had waited for Adrian Blackmere to choose her. That night, she stopped waiting, and neither of them yet knew that another man had witnessed enough to understand exactly what Adrian had thrown away. 6 years earlier, before Adrian Blackmere had learned how easily power could rearrange a man's priorities, Eleanor had known him simply as the young heir who came to her father's estate with more worries than confidence. Then his father died without warning, leaving Adrian a dukedom burdened by debts, neglected farms, angry creditors, and hundreds of families whose livelihoods depended upon decisions he barely knew how to make. Eleanor stayed. She spent long evenings beside him, sorting through tenant accounts, until candlelight blurred the figures on the page. When experienced stewards dismissed Adrian as an inexperienced young duke destined to lose everything, Eleanor quietly found errors that saved Blackmere thousands. During those exhausted months, Adrian repeatedly assured her that once the estate was stable, there would finally be room for the future they had imagined together. The estate eventually recovered. But before Adrian could fulfill that promise, his mother became seriously ill. Eleanor stayed again. For months, she divided her time between Whitmore Hall and Blackmere, sitting beside the Duchess during difficult nights and carrying messages to Adrian whenever his responsibilities kept him away. By the time his mother recovered, another year had disappeared. Adrian was grateful, affectionate, and certain that Eleanor understood why marriage still had to wait. She did understand. That had always been the problem. Then Parliament discovered Adrian Blackmere. His intelligence, name, and rapidly restored fortune made him useful to powerful men at court. Invitations multiplied. Political alliances became important. Adrian began spending more time in London, promising Eleanor that he was securing the life they would someday share. Someday became another year, then another. Eleanor's father saw what she refused to see. Shortly before his death, he warned her that a man who truly intended to make her part of his future should not require her entire present as evidence of devotion. Eleanor had smiled away the warning. She believed Adrian loved her, and perhaps he did, but her father died without ever seeing the promise fulfilled. Now, returning home from the royal ball 6 years later, Eleanor understood why that memory hurt more than Adrian's engagement announcement. Her father had not been questioning Adrian's feelings. He had been questioning his choices. Eleanor entered her bedroom without calling for her maid. She removed the pale blue gown Adrian had once loved and folded it carefully across a chair. Only then did she open the lowest drawer of her writing desk. Inside were 6 years of letters, promises from difficult winters, apologies from missed summers, affection written between parliamentary sessions and family emergencies, a lifetime of almost, preserved in Adrian's handwriting. Eleanor placed every letter inside a wooden box and turned the key. She did not burn them. She was not ready to pretend that 6 years had meant nothing, but she was finally ready to stop giving them a 7th. And if you've ever believed Eleanor deserved better than a lifetime of waiting, tell me in the comments what you would have done in her place. If you enjoy stories of royal betrayal, forbidden love, and unforgettable reversals, subscribe and join us, because Eleanor's decision to walk away was only the beginning. 3 mornings later, a royal messenger arrived at Whitmore Hall. The Queen herself was summoning Eleanor to the winter gathering at the palace. Eleanor could avoid Adrian's letters. She could avoid Blackmere House, but she could not refuse her queen. And waiting for her at court would be Adrian Blackmere, and the woman he had chosen instead. The Queen's winter gathering began beneath a sky the color of polished silver, with carriages arriving one after another through the palace gates, and footmen carrying trunks into rooms already overflowing with aristocrats. Eleanor entered quietly, determined to survive the week without becoming a spectacle. Adrian seemed equally determined to behave as though nothing permanent had happened between them. On the first morning, a bouquet of white roses arrived at Eleanor's chamber, with no note, because Adrian knew she would recognize them. They had always been her favorite. She sent them back. That afternoon, another servant appeared, carrying a sealed letter bearing the Blackmere crest. Eleanor recognized Adrian's handwriting before the envelope reached her hands. She returned that too. By evening, Adrian had finally understood that silence was not going to soften her. He found Eleanor the following day in the palace conservatory, where winter sunlight filtered through tall glass windows and settled across rows of orange trees. She had deliberately chosen the quietest corner of the palace, but Adrian entered as though he still possessed the right to follow her anywhere. He began carefully, reminding her that they had known each other too long to allow one painful decision to destroy everything between them. He spoke of friendship, history, loyalty, and the years in which Eleanor had understood him better than anyone else. For once, Eleanor did not make his argument easier for him. She told him it had never been one decision. It had been hundreds. Every dinner he cancelled because Parliament suddenly mattered more. Every promise postponed because Blackmere required another sacrifice. Every season she watched pass, while Adrian assured her that the next would be different. Every time he chose something else, and expected Eleanor to make that choice painless by understanding it. Adrian stared at her as though she were describing a relationship he had never witnessed. Perhaps, in some ways, she was. He remembered her patience. He remembered her loyalty. He remembered the certainty of always finding Eleanor exactly where he had left her. He had simply never considered what those years had cost her. Then frustration overcame whatever remorse had begun to form. After everything they had been to one another, Adrian insisted she could not simply walk away. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then, with a calmness that cut deeper than anger, she reminded him that he had managed it beautifully 3 nights earlier. She left before he could answer. That evening, an unexpected seating change placed Eleanor several chairs away from Adrian at the Queen's formal dinner and beside a man she had previously known only by reputation. Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Ravenshire. He was the king's cousin, one of the wealthiest landowners in the kingdom, and according to society, so humorless that women abandoned attempts at conversation before dessert. Eleanor expected polite silence. Instead, Nathaniel asked what she thought of a proposed winter relief scheme for tenant farmers in the northern counties. The question caught her completely unprepared, not because she lacked an answer, but because almost no man at court had ever asked for one. Eleanor offered a cautious criticism of the proposal's grain estimates. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, then asked another question. Within minutes, they were discussing transport costs, tenant rents, and why short-term charity often failed when estates ignored agricultural recovery. Then Nathaniel mentioned a proposal Blackmere had presented to Parliament 2 years earlier. Eleanor knew it immediately. She had written most of the calculations. Nathaniel knew that too. Blackmere had presented the proposal, he observed, but the figures were Eleanor's. For several seconds, she could only look at him. Adrian had always praised her intelligence privately. Nathaniel had recognized it without being invited to. Before dinner ended, he asked whether she would consider serving on a royal relief committee, preparing recommendations for several struggling northern estates. Eleanor almost laughed from surprise. Adrian had spent years assuring her that Parliament and estate policy were unnecessarily harsh worlds for a woman. Nathaniel's expression barely changed when she told him so. Then he remarked that, if Blackmere truly believed that, he had been wasting an extraordinary mind. It was not flirtation. That was precisely why Eleanor remembered it. Later, when the ballroom opened and the orchestra began the first waltz, Eleanor stood near the edge of the floor, watching couples gather. Across the room, Adrian started toward her. For 6 years, whenever they attended a ball together, her first dance had belonged to him. He approached with the unconscious confidence of a man expecting an old tradition to survive every new wound. He was only a few steps away when Nathaniel reached Eleanor first. The Duke of Ravenshire offered his hand and asked for the dance. Eleanor saw Adrian stop. For one brief moment, 6 years of habit pulled at her. Then she looked away from Adrian and toward the man standing patiently before her. She placed her hand in Nathaniel's and said yes. For the first time in 6 years, Adrian Blackmere was the one left waiting. Working beside Nathaniel changed Eleanor's days in ways she had not expected. The Queen's Relief Committee met twice each week in a long council chamber overlooking the palace gardens, and from the very first session, Eleanor discovered that Nathaniel had not invited her merely to be courteous, he expected her to contribute. So she did. Within days, Eleanor was questioning grain estimates, challenging transport costs, and identifying villages whose rent burdens made temporary relief almost useless. She had spent years helping Adrian understand estate accounts, but those conversations had always taken place behind closed doors. Here, her ideas were being heard by men who controlled entire counties. Not all of them welcomed it. During one meeting, an elderly marquis interrupted Eleanor halfway through an explanation and began answering the question for her. Eleanor stopped speaking out of habit. Nathaniel did not. He simply looked across the table and said that Lady Eleanor had not finished. Nothing more. No dramatic defense. No speech about her intelligence. He merely returned the room to her, as though her right to finish a sentence should never have been questioned in the first place. Eleanor continued, and afterward, she found herself remembering that moment far longer than she wanted to admit. Adrian noticed too. He saw Nathaniel asking Eleanor's opinion before offering his own. He watched him introduce her to ministers as the woman responsible for several of the committee's most useful recommendations. Worse still, Nathaniel publicly credited Eleanor for calculations Adrian had once presented without explaining where they had come from. Adrian could not object. He was engaged to Celeste. That fact followed him everywhere now, especially whenever he saw Eleanor smiling at another man. The jealousy came quietly at first, a tightening of his jaw. A glance held too long, a conversation interrupted, for no reason beyond his need to remind Eleanor he was still there. But Eleanor was beginning to learn that noticing a man and revolving around him were not the same thing. Several weeks later, the committee traveled north to inspect a village damaged by winter flooding. The roads were thick with mud. Several cottages had been abandoned, and families crowded inside a temporary parish hall while repairs continued. When one of the officials suggested the committee observe conditions from the road, Eleanor stepped down from the carriage. She wanted to speak to the tenants herself. Nathaniel followed. Soon both of them were ankle-deep in mud, listening to farmers explain what reports had failed to show. Eleanor asked about livestock losses, damaged wells, and how many families could survive another month without assistance. Nathaniel did not hover over her. He simply worked beside her. By the time they started back toward Ravenshire, evening had already fallen, and heavy rain had turned the road into something almost impassable. Less than an hour later, one carriage wheel sank deep into the mud. The servants began working to free it, while Eleanor and Nathaniel waited inside a small roadside lodge nearby. For the first time, there were no ministers, no servants within hearing distance, and no court, watching every glance between them. Their conversation wandered. Eleanor eventually asked the question society had been asking about Nathaniel for years. Why had he never married? Nathaniel was silent for a moment before admitting that once, many years earlier, he had nearly done so. The woman had been suitable in every way, beautiful, intelligent, well-connected. But shortly before the wedding, Nathaniel discovered she loved another man. Eleanor expected the story to end in betrayal or resentment. Instead, Nathaniel explained that he had released her from the engagement. There was no anger in his voice when he said she deserved the freedom to choose the man she loved. Then he added that he deserved a wife who chose him. The simplicity of it struck Eleanor harder than any romantic declaration could have. Nathaniel spoke of mutual choice as though it were the most ordinary requirement in the world. Adrian had spent 6 years treating it like something she should be grateful to receive eventually. Eleanor looked away, toward the rain-darkened window. Nathaniel seemed to understand more from her silence than she wanted him to, and perhaps because he understood, he did something Eleanor had never expected. He did not move closer. He did not turn the moment into a confession. He did not ask what she felt for Adrian. Instead, he gave her space. Nathaniel knew enough to realize that Eleanor's heart had not become empty simply because she had decided to stop waiting. 6 years could not be erased by a few dances, a committee meeting, or one honest conversation beside a rain-soaked road. So he did not pursue her, and strangely, that restraint unsettled Eleanor more than pursuit would have. Adrian had spent years telling her how deeply he loved her, while continually asking her to accept less. Nathaniel had promised her nothing, yet for the first time in years, Eleanor was beginning to understand what it felt like to stand beside a man without competing for the right to matter. Over the weeks that followed, Eleanor and Nathaniel settled into an ease neither of them seemed willing to name. Their work on the relief committee gave them reasons to spend long hours together, sometimes surrounded by ministers and estate managers, sometimes bent over maps and ledgers after everyone else had gone. Nathaniel never hovered, never searched for excuses to touch her, and never treated every quiet moment as an opportunity to turn friendship into courtship. That absence of pressure made Eleanor feel strangely safe. One afternoon, she became so absorbed in revising grain allocations that she worked through luncheon without noticing. Nathaniel noticed. He said nothing about it. He simply disappeared for several minutes, then returned while a servant placed bread, cheese, fruit, and hot tea beside Eleanor's papers. When she accused him of ordering her about through food, Nathaniel replied that starving herself was a very inefficient method of improving the kingdom. Eleanor laughed before she could stop herself. The sound surprised them both. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, almost as though he had discovered something unexpectedly precious. Then he returned to his papers without comment. It was Eleanor who found herself thinking about the moment later. She was beginning to notice things about him too. During another estate visit, Eleanor discovered that several injured labourers were receiving pensions directly from Ravenshire accounts. When she praised the programme during dinner, the steward quietly revealed that there was no official programme. Nathaniel had been paying the pensions himself for years. When Eleanor confronted him, he merely shrugged and asked what possible use generosity had if it required an audience. She teased him that London society would be devastated to discover the supposedly cold Duke of Ravenshire possessed a heart. Nathaniel replied that he trusted her to protect his reputation. Eleanor laughed again, and something between them softened. Several days later, while inspecting another Ravenshire property, rain swept across the countryside so suddenly that they were forced to take shelter inside an abandoned chapel near the edge of the estate. The roof leaked in 2 places, the pews were covered with dust, and rain hammered against the old stained glass windows, while Eleanor and Nathaniel waited for the storm to pass. Perhaps it was the isolation. Perhaps it was the quiet way Nathaniel never demanded explanations from her. But Eleanor finally admitted what she had struggled to say, even to herself. She had spent so many years proving that she could wait for Adrian that she had forgotten to ask whether she ever should have. Nathaniel did not seize the confession as an opportunity to criticize Adrian. He did not tell her she deserved him. Instead, he simply reminded her that whatever happened next, she should not make that decision about Adrian either. The words followed Eleanor long after the rain stopped. Nathaniel was not asking her to choose him. He was asking her to choose herself. And that frightened her almost as much as it freed her, because only days later, Eleanor returned to court and discovered that Adrian still knew exactly where the weakest places in her heart remained. Waiting inside her chamber was a small wooden music box. Eleanor stopped the moment she saw it. It had belonged to her father. The mechanism had broken shortly before his death, and despite several attempts, Eleanor had never managed to repair it. Now the little box played again. Beside it, lay a single note in Adrian's handwriting. He remembered everything, Ellie. For the first time since walking away, Eleanor cried, not because she had forgotten what Adrian had done, but because love did not disappear, simply because dignity had finally spoken louder. That evening, she agreed to see him privately. Adrian looked exhausted. He told her he missed their conversations, her laughter, the way she understood him before he had to explain himself. He insisted that his engagement to Celeste was a political necessity, not the measure of what Eleanor meant to him. In time, he said, circumstances could change. Then he reached for Eleanor's hand. For one dangerous moment, 6 years rushed back. The promises, the closeness, the life she had imagined beside him. Eleanor almost allowed herself to believe again. Instead, she asked him one question. If Celeste Harrington possessed no great fortune, and Eleanor possessed twice as much, which woman would he marry? Adrian's hand went still. Eleanor waited. He opened his mouth, but no answer came. And in that silence, Eleanor finally heard the truth, more clearly than she ever had in all his promises. If circumstances had been different, Adrian might have chosen her. But circumstances were not different, and when the choice had actually been his to make, he had chosen someone else. Eleanor gently withdrew her hand. Then she left him standing alone, with the music box still playing behind her. For several days after leaving Adrian beside the music box, Eleanor carried one stubborn thought she could not quite silence. Perhaps he had truly believed there was no other choice. It was easier to bear his engagement that way, easier to imagine that duty had defeated love, rather than accept that love had simply ranked lower than ambition. That fragile explanation lasted until Lady Celeste Harrington asked to speak with her privately. Eleanor expected hostility. She expected accusation, perhaps even a warning to stay away from Adrian. Instead, Celeste received her in a quiet morning room overlooking the palace gardens and dismissed the servants before taking the seat opposite her. There was no triumph in Celeste's expression, only discomfort. She began carefully, admitting that she had known about Eleanor long before the engagement was announced. Eleanor felt something inside her tighten. Celeste explained that Adrian had approached her father months earlier with the proposal himself, not after pressure from his family, not after an order from the crown, not because some sudden crisis had left him trapped. Adrian had initiated the arrangement. The Harrington fortune could strengthen Blackmere's estates, expand Adrian's political influence, and finance the ambitions he had spent years cultivating. Celeste's father also possessed the connections necessary to place Adrian within reach of a cabinet position. Eleanor listened without interrupting. Each detail stripped away another excuse she had quietly preserved for him. Then Celeste said something worse. When she first learned how close Eleanor and Adrian had been, she had asked him directly whether another woman stood between them. Adrian had not denied Eleanor mattered. He had simply assured Celeste there would be no difficulty. Eleanor would understand. She always did. The words struck harder than the engagement announcement ever had, because suddenly Eleanor saw the entire decision clearly. Adrian had not chosen Celeste while fearing that he might lose Eleanor. He had chosen Celeste because he believed losing Eleanor was impossible. Her patience had not merely failed to protect her, it had become part of his calculation. Celeste watched the color leave Eleanor's face, and quietly admitted that she had assumed Eleanor already knew the arrangement for what it was. "I thought you knew." Eleanor managed to thank her before leaving. She did not remember crossing the corridor. She barely remembered reaching her chamber. That night, long after the palace had fallen quiet, Eleanor opened the wooden box she had locked days earlier. Adrian's letters lay exactly where she had placed them, She picked up the oldest first. In it, a younger Adrian promised that once Blackmere's debts were settled, there would be nothing left between them and marriage. The next letter asked for patience, while his mother recovered. Another promised that Parliament would only delay them for one season. Another told her that no ambition could ever matter more than the future they shared. Eleanor sat beside the fire and read them one at a time. Then, without anger, she lowered the first letter into the flames. The paper curled slowly. The ink darkened. Then it disappeared. She fed another into the fire, and another. There was no dramatic fury in the act, no satisfaction, only grief. 6 years reduced to ash, not because those years had been false, but because Eleanor finally understood that love could be real and still not be enough. She had spent too long believing Adrian's feelings excused his choices. Now she knew his choices were the only part that had ever truly mattered. By the time the final letter burned, tears had dried cold against her face. A soft knock came at the door. Nathaniel stood outside. He had come to deliver committee papers and stopped the moment he saw her. His eyes moved briefly toward the dying fire, then back to Eleanor. He asked no questions. He did not demand to know what Adrian had done. He did not offer to confront him. He simply asked whether she wanted him to stay. That small kindness nearly broke what little composure Eleanor had left. She nodded. So Nathaniel entered and sat in the chair opposite her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire settled into embers between them, while Eleanor stared at the ashes of the life she had once believed was waiting for her. Nathaniel did not try to fill the silence. He simply remained, and somewhere in that quiet room, Eleanor began to understand the difference between a man who wanted to keep her and a man who could not bear to make her carry pain alone. The peace Eleanor had found beside that dying fire did not last long. By the end of the week, whispers had begun moving through court with the efficiency of something carefully fed. At first, Eleanor noticed only the silences. Conversation stopped when she entered drawing rooms. Women who had once greeted her warmly suddenly found other people to speak with. Invitations that normally arrived without question failed to appear. Then the stories reached her. Some claimed Eleanor had attached herself to Nathaniel only after Adrian rejected her, desperate to prove she could still secure a duke. Others suggested her work on the Queen's committee had merely been an excuse to remain close to Ravenshire. The ugliest version accused her of deliberately provoking Adrian's jealousy in the hope of destroying his engagement to Celeste. None of it was true. That hardly mattered. At court, a lie repeated elegantly enough could become more useful than the truth. Eleanor endured the whispers until Adrian's name began appearing inside them. People claimed his silence confirmed everything. If Eleanor were truly innocent, they reasoned, surely the Duke of Blackmere, the man who had known her for 6 years, would defend her. Adrian knew the rumors were false. That was why Eleanor asked him for help only once. She found him after a parliamentary reception and told him plainly that she did not need affection, apologies, or another private promise. She needed him to tell the truth publicly. Nothing more. Adrian's discomfort appeared almost immediately. A public statement, he explained, might invite questions about the nature of their former relationship. Celeste's father would consider it humiliating. Newspapers might become interested. His political opponents could turn the entire scandal against him, just as serious discussions about a cabinet appointment were beginning. Eleanor listened as the familiar pattern assembled itself before her. There was always something: an estate, a sick mother, Parliament, an engagement, now a cabinet position. Adrian assured her that gossip moved quickly, and disappeared just as quickly. If she simply left London for a few weeks, people would find something else to discuss. Eleanor laughed softly. There was nothing amusing in it. For years, she had believed circumstances kept forcing Adrian into impossible choices. Now she saw that he had been making the same choice all along. Whenever protecting Eleanor required sacrificing something he valued, Eleanor became the sacrifice. Adrian mistook her laughter for surrender. It was the opposite. For the first time, she saw him without the memories of the boy she had loved, standing between them. And once she saw him clearly, she could no longer pretend not to. Nathaniel reacted very differently. When he learned that several gentlemen had openly suggested Eleanor had pursued him for his title, his anger was immediate. He was prepared to confront them publicly and make it unmistakably clear that Eleanor had never behaved improperly toward him. Eleanor stopped him. She appreciated what he wanted to do, but she refused to exchange one powerful man's protection for another's. For 6 years, too much of her identity had existed beside Adrian Blackmere's name. She would not rebuild herself beneath Nathaniel Ashford's. If her reputation was to be restored, she wanted the truth to restore it, not fear of a duke. Nathaniel did not argue. That mattered almost as much as his willingness to defend her. He simply asked what she needed. Eleanor told him she needed time, so he gave it to her. Days later, she left London for Whitmore Hall. Society interpreted her departure exactly as she expected. To some, retreat meant guilt. To others, it proved she had finally understood she no longer belonged among them. Adrian believed something different. He assumed Eleanor merely needed distance. She had withdrawn before. She had been angry before. Eventually, he believed, the years between them would draw her back. Nathaniel made no such assumption. He sent no romantic letters. He did not appear unexpectedly at Whitmore Hall. He did not use concern as an excuse to pursue her. For once, Eleanor was given exactly what she had requested: space. And that silence forced her to confront something far more frightening than court gossip. Whitmore Hall was filled with reminders of the life she had placed on hold. Her father's books remained in the library. Estate papers she had once intended to manage gathered dust inside old cabinets. Plans she had abandoned when Adrian's problems became more urgent still existed in her own handwriting. For nearly all of her adult life, Eleanor had been someone's support, Adrian's confidant, Adrian's advisor, Adrian's almost wife, and lately, perhaps, the woman Nathaniel might come to love. But alone in the house where she had grown up, with neither man asking anything from her, Eleanor was confronted by a question she had avoided for years. Who was Lady Eleanor Whitmore when she was not waiting for Adrian Blackmere and not wondering what Nathaniel Ashford might become? Whitmore Hall had never felt so quiet. For the first few days, Eleanor mistook that quiet for loneliness. There was no Adrian arriving with another crisis, disguised as duty. No Nathaniel asking her opinion over maps and ledgers. No court gossip pressing against the walls. Only the life she had left behind. She began in her father's library. Dust lay across old account books, estate reports, and plans she had once promised herself she would finish. Before Adrian's troubles had consumed so much of her time, Eleanor had wanted to improve Whitmore's schools, reorganize tenant leases, and create something lasting for the families who had worked the land for generations. Somewhere along the way, those ambitions had become less urgent than Adrian's. Now, for the first time, she asked herself why. The answer came inside a bundle of unopened correspondence. 3 village schools, supported partly by Whitmore funds, were preparing to close before spring. Money once reserved for teachers and repairs had been redirected during years of financial difficulty, and unless new support was found, nearly 100 children would lose their classrooms. Eleanor read every letter twice, then she stopped thinking about London. For days, Adrian barely crossed her mind. She summoned the estate steward, examined the accounts herself, and released enough from her personal inheritance to keep all 3 schools operating through the winter. But temporary rescue was not enough. Eleanor wanted something that would survive her. So she drafted a proposal for a permanent educational trust, connecting wealthy estates with struggling village schools, allowing landowners to contribute according to income while protecting school funds from being quietly redirected elsewhere. She sent the proposal to the Queen's Relief Committee. Not to Nathaniel, to the committee. 2 weeks later, a royal carriage arrived at Whitmore Hall. The Queen wanted Eleanor back in London. Her proposal had already gained support from several counties, and Her Majesty wanted Eleanor to present it personally before the committee. For once, Eleanor was not returning to court because of Adrian Blackmere. She was not returning because Nathaniel Ashford had invited her. She was returning because something she had built mattered. When Eleanor entered the palace again, the difference was subtle enough that some people noticed it only after she passed. She wore none of the Blackmere jewelry Adrian had given her over the years, but neither did she wear anything associated with Ravenshire. There was no man's crest at her throat, no borrowed symbol of protection, only Eleanor. The whispers began almost immediately. This time, she did not avoid them. At the committee hearing, after presenting the school trust proposal, Eleanor asked permission to address one final matter. The room became very still. She produced letters, dated committee records, travel schedules, and correspondence documenting every official meeting she had shared with Nathaniel before Adrian's engagement was announced. Nothing secret, nothing improper, nothing resembling the desperate pursuit court society had invented. Several senior committee members confirmed her account without hesitation. Eleanor did not accuse anyone. She did not cry. She simply placed the truth on the table and allowed everyone who had enjoyed the lie to sit with their embarrassment. By the following morning, the gossip that had taken weeks to build was collapsing, and Nathaniel had not said a word. He had remained near the back of the room throughout Eleanor's statement, watching her defend herself exactly as she had asked to. There was pride in his expression. Not pride because she belonged to him, pride because she had never needed to. Adrian saw it too, and perhaps that was the moment something inside him finally turned from jealousy into fear. His engagement to Celeste had deteriorated badly. Their conversations had become colder, their disagreements more public, and the political future he had sacrificed Eleanor to secure no longer felt nearly as certain. For 6 years, Adrian had always known where Eleanor stood. Now everyone at court seemed to see her value, except the man who had spent those years asking her to wait. He found her alone after the hearing. There was none of his usual confidence when he approached. For once, Adrian did not begin with explanations. He simply admitted that he had made a mistake. Months earlier, those words might have undone Eleanor. Now she heard them without feeling the ground shift beneath her. Adrian stepped closer. He told her he had been thinking about everything, about Celeste, about the engagement, about the life he had traded away because he had been too ambitious to recognize what was already beside him. Then he asked the question Eleanor had once dreamed of hearing. He needed to know whether there was still a chance for them. Across the room, Nathaniel stood speaking quietly with one of the ministers. Eleanor's eyes moved toward him for only a moment. Then she looked back at Adrian, and Adrian followed her glance. His face tightened, but Eleanor's voice remained calm. Her answer, she told him, had nothing to do with Nathaniel, and for the first time, Adrian Blackmere seemed to understand that this was no longer a contest between two men. It was a decision Eleanor would make for herself. By the night of the Royal Foundation Ball, everyone in London already knew. The engagement between Adrian Blackmere and Lady Celeste Harrington was over. No official explanation had been given, but the truth travelled quickly through drawing rooms and private dinners. Adrian had ended it himself. The political alliance he once considered essential had been abandoned, and for the first time in years, the Duke of Blackmere seemed willing to sacrifice ambition for something else, or rather, for someone else. Eleanor heard the whispers before she entered the ballroom. She knew what people expected now. They expected a grand reconciliation. They expected 6 years of waiting to be rewarded at last. Some even spoke as though Adrian's broken engagement had erased everything that came before it. Eleanor knew better. The ballroom glittered beneath hundreds of candles, every polished surface reflecting gold as the orchestra began its first waltz. Nathaniel was somewhere among the guests, speaking with members of the royal committee, but Eleanor did not search for him. Then the crowd shifted. Adrian was walking toward her. Conversation softened around them. He stopped before Eleanor and held out his hand. For a moment, she simply looked at it. This was the hand she had once imagined taking before an altar, the hand she had held during funerals, financial disasters, and sleepless nights when Adrian believed Blackmere might collapse beneath him. Now it waited for her, in front of half the court. Eleanor accepted, not because she wanted him back, because some endings deserved to be faced rather than avoided. They moved onto the dance floor, and for several moments neither spoke. Adrian's hand rested carefully at her waist, almost tentative now, as though he finally understood that familiarity no longer gave him ownership of closeness. Then he began telling Eleanor everything she had once longed to hear. He loved her. He had always loved her. He admitted that he should have chosen her from the beginning. He had been afraid of losing influence, afraid of failing Blackmere, afraid that choosing love over political advantage would make him weak. And because Eleanor had always understood him, he had convinced himself she always would. That was his greatest mistake. Adrian told her ending the engagement had cost him powerful allies. Celeste's father had withdrawn his political support. The cabinet position Adrian had spent years pursuing was almost certainly gone. But none of it mattered anymore, not compared with losing her. Then, beneath the chandeliers and the watching eyes of the court, Adrian asked Eleanor to marry him. For one dangerous heartbeat, the world seemed to return to what it had once been. This was the moment she had imagined through 6 winters. Adrian choosing her openly, Adrian risking something for her, Adrian finally saying that she mattered more. Eleanor felt tears gather before she could stop them, because some part of her still loved the man standing before her. She did not need to lie about that. 6 years could not vanish simply because she had learned to survive without them. Adrian saw the emotion in her face, and hope returned to his. But Eleanor knew something now that the woman she had been 6 months earlier had never understood. Receiving what you once begged for did not mean you still had to want it. She looked at Adrian and told him quietly that she had wanted him to choose her for 6 years. His fingers tightened around hers. Then she finished. She did not want to be chosen because losing her had finally become painful. Adrian stopped moving. Around them, the dance continued, couples passing as though nothing had changed. He insisted he had changed. Perhaps he had, Eleanor said. But she had too. For years, She had believed love meant being patient enough, loyal enough, understanding enough to wait until someone finally decided she was worth putting first. She would not live like that anymore. Adrian stared at her, and for the first time, there was nothing left for him to negotiate. No political argument could repair this. 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 They had once been. There was no satisfaction in watching his face fall. No revenge. Only peace. When the music ended, Eleanor released his hand and walked away. Adrian remained where she left him. For years, he had believed Eleanor's loyalty was endless. Only now did he understand that even endless patience could reach an ending. Eleanor stepped through the terrace doors into the cold night air. The silence outside was almost startling after the ballroom. She rested both hands against the stone railing and breathed. A few moments later, Nathaniel joined her. He did not ask what had happened. He did not mention Adrian. He simply looked at Eleanor and asked whether she was all right. She nodded, though her eyes were still wet. Then she told him Adrian had asked for another chance. Nathaniel's expression barely changed. He remained quiet. Eleanor turned toward him. Wasn't he going to ask what she had said? Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, only if she wanted him to know, and somehow, that answer reached deeper than any declaration could have. He would not turn her decision into proof that he had won. He would not make her choice about himself. So Eleanor told him. She had said no. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, but still he did not reach for her. Then, for the first time, he allowed himself to say what he had been holding back. He could not promise they would always agree. He could not promise he would never disappoint her. He could not promise a life without difficulty. But he could promise one thing. Eleanor would never have to wonder whether she mattered more to him than the convenience of keeping her. His voice softened, and if she ever chose him, there would be no second place waiting for her. For 6 years, Eleanor had begged one man to make her his first choice. Standing beneath the winter stars, she finally understood the difference. Nathaniel had never asked her to compete for the position at all. Nathaniel did not ask Eleanor to marry him that night, and Eleanor was grateful for it. For the first time in years, she did not want to rush toward another promise, simply because it felt safer than uncertainty. She wanted to know what remained when there was no Adrian to escape from, no scandal to survive, and no wounded heart demanding immediate comfort. Nathaniel understood. So the months that followed became something Eleanor had never truly experienced before. A courtship without competition. They continued their work with the Queen's Relief Committee. They traveled between estates, inspected schools, argued over budgets, and occasionally discovered that liking each other did not mean agreeing about everything. Once, Nathaniel proposed reducing funding for a program Eleanor considered essential. She opposed him in front of the entire committee. Years earlier, she might have softened her argument to protect the feelings of the man she loved. Nathaniel merely listened. Then he changed part of his proposal because her reasoning was better. Afterward, he informed her that being contradicted by Eleanor was becoming an expensive habit. She told him being wrong so frequently was entirely his own fault. Nathaniel laughed, and Eleanor realized she was laughing more too. Slowly, something inside her changed. She stopped measuring love by sacrifice. She no longer believed affection had to be earned by making herself endlessly useful. Nathaniel did not love her more when she agreed with him, nor withdraw when she disappointed him. If Eleanor needed rest, he did not make her feel guilty for taking it. If she wanted something different from what he wanted, he listened. she began to understand that security did not come from being indispensable. It came from being valued, even when she was simply herself. By spring, the woman who entered another royal gathering scarcely resembled the one who had stood applauding Adrian's engagement months earlier. Not because she wore finer jewels, not because Nathaniel stood nearby, because Eleanor was happy. Adrian saw it. They encountered each other alone near the palace gardens, and for a moment, the past stood quietly between them. Adrian looked different too. Some of the restless ambition had gone from him. He did not ask whether she still thought about him. He did not mention Nathaniel. He simply apologized, not for choosing Celeste alone, but for all the years before her, for every promise he had delayed, because he believed Eleanor's love would survive another disappointment. He admitted that he had mistaken her loyalty for permission to keep hurting her. Eleanor listened. Then she forgave him. Not because what happened no longer mattered, because she no longer needed anger to keep the door closed. They parted with kindness, and that was all. Some relationships could be forgiven without being restored. Several weeks later, Nathaniel invited Eleanor to Ravenshire. He took her beyond the main house, to a garden overlooking one of the village schools, supported by the educational trust she had created. Children were spilling into the courtyard below, their voices carried upward on the warm afternoon wind. There were no nobles watching, no orchestra, no carefully arranged audience waiting to applaud, only Eleanor and Nathaniel. He told her that if she accepted what he was about to ask, society would say he had made her the Duchess of Ravenshire. Eleanor smiled. Nathaniel did not. He looked at her with the quiet seriousness she had learned meant his next words mattered. But the truth, he told her, was that Eleanor had already become entirely herself long before he had been given the privilege of loving her. Then Nathaniel asked her to marry him. Eleanor did not think about Adrian. She did not think about revenge. She did not think about proving anything to anyone. She looked at the man before her and thought only of the life they had begun building together, and she said yes. Their wedding took place months later in the royal chapel. The Queen attended. Villagers from Whitmore and Ravenshire crowded the road outside. Bells rang across the countryside as Eleanor's carriage approached beneath a brilliant autumn sky. Inside, aristocrats filled every pew. Nathaniel stood before the altar. The king was only feet away. Ministers, dukes, and powerful families surrounded him. But when Eleanor entered the chapel, Nathaniel's eyes never left her. Not for the king, not for the nobles, not for anyone. And Eleanor finally knew what it felt like to walk toward a man without wondering whether something more important might eventually make him turn away. For 6 years, Eleanor Whitmore had believed love was measured by how long a woman was willing to wait. But love had never asked her to remain in second place. Fear had, habit had, hope had. And once she finally released them, Eleanor discovered that the right man did not ask her to compete for a place in his heart. Nathaniel had never needed to lose her to understand her worth. He had seen it from the beginning, and perhaps that was the greatest difference between the man she once begged to choose her and the man she eventually chose for herself. Adrian Blackmere had learned how much Eleanor mattered only after discovering what life felt like without her. Nathaniel Ashford loved her while she was standing right in front of him. And if you were Eleanor, would you have given Adrian another chance after he finally broke his engagement and chose her? Or had he already lost that right years ago? Tell me in the comments, because I want to know which side you're on. And if you enjoyed Eleanor's journey from someone's second choice to someone's unquestionable first, subscribe and join us for more unforgettable stories of royal love, betrayal, and redemption.